Good morning. I'm Sherman Stanford, and this is Making Sense of the Chaos. Sorry, I'm a little late. I lost track of the time. Every morning we go over our basic principles, actually, the factual framework for understanding what's going on around us. We'll do that again today. First, God created the cosmos for His glory, not for man's. Second, the jewel of creation is mankind. Third, although in no sense the author of evil, God ordained Adam's fall. That's a difficult thing to understand, but clearly the Bible does teach that. Some would say, well, that's a contradiction. No, it's a mystery, something we don't understand. That's not the same thing as a contradiction. And to assume that what we don't understand must be a contradiction is rather prideful. It's assuming that we're the standard of all truth, and our understanding determines whether a thing can be true or not. Fourth, in Adam, the entire creation fell, including all of mankind. Fifth, as a result of the fall, God pronounced the curse of enmity between the seed of the woman, Jesus Christ, and all those who will spend eternity with him, and the seed of the serpent, Satan, his demons, and the balance of humanity. This is known as the great antithesis. Sixth, all subsequent human social experience is an outworking of this antithesis. Seventh, the unregenerate, fallen men are without excuse. They know God, Paul tells us in Romans 1, but they suppress the truth about God in culpable self-deceit. He tells us they exchange the truth of God for a lie. Today we're opening the second section of my book. This is called The Seduction and Reformation of the Church. And essentially, we're going to be going over the first 16 or 18 centuries of the church's existence following Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Obviously, if we're going to talk about the church's existence for the first 16 or 18 centuries, there's an elephant in the room that we're going to have to talk about, the Roman Catholic Church. And we're going to have to make some judgments about whether what it has done is right or wrong. Before I get there, I'd like to share some of my own personal history, because I'm fairly sure that there will be those who will accuse me of personal animosity toward the church. That's simply not true. I was raised a Roman Catholic in South Louisiana. My parents, in fact, had 9 children because they were Roman Catholics. And for Roman Catholics of a certain age, you understand exactly what I'm talking about. The priest taught against birth control, so families were large. And we went to church every Sunday. I was an ordinary kid as far as that went. I sometimes was zealous for the church and sometimes was not, just as all the other kids were. There wasn't anything remarkable about me one way or the other in that regard. When I was in my mid-teens, I turned my back on the church, but not so much because of what the church was teaching, although there were some things that I found unsatisfying, some questions I had that I was told not to ask. But that wasn't the real reason I turned from the church. The real reason is that this was the early 60s and I was riding the wave of the sexual revolution and the death of Christ, the death of God movement. I was seeking my own autonomy, and I did for 20 years. When I returned to Christ, actually I wasn't even ever a Christian, even though I was a member of the Roman Catholic Church, because I didn't even understand much about what I was supposed to be committing myself to, and there's no sense in which my church going early in my life could be considered a commitment to Christ. But when God did work on me and did regenerate me at age 35, at that time I was able to examine the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church and the basis for those, and I rejected that, and I became a Protestant. Now, for all of those of you who are Protestants, I hope you understand that the fact that you're a Protestant, that you're not a Roman Catholic, means that at least in principle, you believe the Roman Catholic Church is wrong in its theology. If you don't believe the Roman Catholic Church is wrong in its theology, then you would be a Roman Catholic. If you don't think there's any difference between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism on the basic theological issues, then you haven't studied the basic theological issues. You don't know what you're talking about. And so I'm going to have to talk about the Roman Catholic Church, and it's going to be fairly negative, but not because I have personal animosity toward the church. I don't. But I do have animosity toward falsehood or error, and there's plenty of that in the Roman Catholic Church. I'm going to step on some toes. I'm not going out of my way to step on toes. My personal preference is not to be confrontational. I always prefer to seek the least personally confrontational way of resolving disputes that I can find, because I find those personal confrontations very distasteful. They upset me, and I prefer not to do that. But if we're going to know the truth, one of the things that we have to understand is that in the fall, it was not just man's moral abilities that fell. Every part of him fell. He fell physically, that is, he's going to die, and he fell intellectually. That is, he makes mistakes in his thinking. That's called the noetic effects of sin. And if we understand that human beings make mistakes in their thinking, then we must understand that we have an obligation to do our best, using God's guidance and the Holy Spirit and the Word of God as our standards, to seek to know what's true. And if you know the truth, you always know it in opposition to errors regarding that truth. And you have an obligation to point out the errors where those step on the toes of the truth. I'd rather be a God-fearer than a man-fearer. I seek to please and honor God because I fear and love Him, and not men. So if I'm upsetting human beings but I'm pleasing God, I can live with that. If I'm upsetting God because I'm trying to please human beings, I got a real problem. So I'm not going out of my way to take shots at the Roman Catholic Church, but there's no way to avoid discussing the history of the Christian church and leave that issue unaddressed. So now, the name of this entire section of the book is The Seduction and Reformation of the Church. That alone gives you an idea that there was something wrong that needed to be fixed in the development of the church. So let's get on with it. The Bible teaches that the church is the bride of Christ. That's all over the place. Revelation 17:9 is one of the places that talks about that. But the wedding feast of the Lamb, there's just a lot of imagery of Jesus as the bridegroom and the church as the bride. As in any love story, the story of Jesus and his arranged bride, it was an arranged marriage, the church, has its rough spots. Early in the relationship, following his sacrifice on her behalf on the cross, she finds her eyes drifting toward the seat of the serpent, attracted to the worldly power represented by the Roman Empire. tracing the development of the seduction, the outrageous flirting, and even unfaithfulness she succumbs to, and the struggle to win her back to truth and faithfulness toward her hero, betrothed slash betrothed, covers 18 or so centuries and the next 100 some odd pages, or for us, the next 6 or 7 weeks. The seduction of the church. In Greek, the term used for church is ecclesia. It means the called out. The church, therefore, is those people from every tribe, tongue, and nation in the world who have been called out of their birth condition as fallen members of the serpent into the body of Christ, the seed of the woman. Okay? Does that make sense? We have this huge mass of fallen people, all of them known as the seed of the serpent. The church has been called out of the seed of the serpent, out of the world, out of sin, out of spiritual death, into spiritual life by the Holy Spirit. Okay? By his death on the cross, the hero of our story, Jesus, paid the ransom or bride price to free selected members of the seed of the serpent from bondage to sin. Now, some would have us believe that he paid a price sufficient to free all sinners from their bondage to sin. Well, if he paid to free them from their bondage to sin, they would be free, or else he paid in vain. Now, frankly, that is simply not even worthy of contemplation, that God would do anything in vain. Everything he does is part of his plan, and it all comes out exactly the way he planned it. To assert anything else to make of God less than God, and would call into question not only his promises regarding your salvation, his promises regarding his providence generally. All things work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to his purposes. Well, not if God's not in charge of all things. How in the world can he assure that all things are going to work together for good? You know, once again, I'm reminded of the image of the fellow on the Ed Sullivan Show years ago who would get the plates spinning on the rods, and he would get maybe 10 or 12 of them spinning, and you'd hold your breath because one would start to wobble and he'd get... Well, that would be a picture of God in the world trying to make things work out, but eventually his plates would be crashing to the floor just like that poor fellow's. No, that was good entertainment, but that can't be a picture of God at work in my life. I mean, really? I can be as certain of God's promises regarding my life and everything working together for my good as I was that fella could keep those plates spinning in the air? I don't think so. If that's the God that you want, help yourself. But that's not the God described in the Bible. No. By his death on the cross, Jesus paid the bride price to free certain people from their sins and to give them new life as members of the seed of the woman, his fiancée, his betrothed. Although he is betrothed to her, she remains subject to the seductive temptations of her dark past. Hey, even today, the church strays, the church goes amiss. Why do we have so many theological errors? Why do we have so many theological teachings butting heads with one another? They certainly are not all right. When they are in direct contradiction, butting heads, they can both be wrong, or one can be wrong and the other can be right, but they cannot both be right. This is fundamental logic, fundamental philosophy. If two people hold contradictory positions, at best, one can be right, but not both. At best, one can be right. At worst, neither is right. Does that make sense? By the way, there's an intriguing parallel between Adam and his bride Eve, and the second Adam, Jesus, and his bride, the church. Okay? Think about this. Eve was taken from the body of Adam, his rib, to become his bride. The church is called out from the body of the offspring of the first Adam. The first Adam's offspring is the seed of the serpent. And the bride of Christ is called out from the seed of the serpent, the body of the seed of the serpent. Just interesting parallel, isn't it? The history of the past 2,000 years has been an unfolding of both the villain's effort to seduce the betrothed bride. Remember now, the villain is the seed of the serpent. The betrothed bride is the seed of the woman. And the hero's patient, that's Jesus, but firm hand, staying the villain and guiding his bride into the path of faithful righteousness. Right, that's the picture that we get. Remember, this is a love story. And so we see it as the unfolding of a cosmic love story. As is often the case where seduction occurs, think about this, especially you guys, but ladies too. The seduction is not motivated by love. Rather, it's motivated by discontent, envy, and hatred. There's a reason why guys who are very skilled at seducing women are known as lady killers. Duh. They don't do it out of love. The villain, the seed of the serpent, in his self-loathing and hatred for his rival Jesus, both his remember now, if you're in rebellion against God, you're in rebellion even against yourself. So you will loathe yourself. Why do we see so much self-loathing in our culture today? It's because there's so much unbelief. If you hate God, you will hate yourself. There's just no way to get around it. Anyway, because of his self-loathing and his hatred for his rival Jesus, the hero, he has no love for the betrothed bride that he's seeking to seduce. On her part, perversely, unable to rid herself of the vestiges of her past, and buoyed by the attentions of the villain, the betrothed bride seems as much determined to blind herself to the fact that he doesn't love her as he is to deceive her regarding that fact. Thinking two suitors are better than one, she halts between full commitment to one or the other. Isn't that much of the history of the church? Paying lip service to her betrothed, Jesus, while surreptitiously, on the sly, entertaining the blandishments of the villain. That's a picture of the development of the church generally, but especially during the first 15 centuries of its development. And we'll get into that in a lot more detail. One of the interesting things to observe about God and the way he operates in the world is the way he uses the seed of the serpent to accomplish his redemptive goals. Okay? We have, for instance, the example in Psalm 50 where after Joseph's brothers had sold him into slavery and he had become the number 2 leader in Egypt, and they were reunited with him. But after Jacob's death, they feared that Joseph was going to seek revenge against them. So they went to him and said, hey, listen, we're your servants. We're not even your brothers anymore. And all we want to do is the right thing with you. But I want you to know that Dad, Jacob, said, don't revenge yourself on your brothers. And what did Joseph say? Your dad, Jacob. Did I say that? Anyway, what Joseph said was, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That is to say, God uses intentionally the evil that he knows that people want to do, he allows them to do, in order that his good purposes will come to pass. People say, well, that's a contradiction. Well, no, it's not. That makes God the author of evil. No, it doesn't. The fact that you want to do evil, and I know you want to do evil, and I restrain you from doing evil most of the time, and sometimes I don't. I just let you go do what you want. That doesn't make me responsible for the evil you do. Nor does it make God responsible for the evil that men do because they want to do evil and he let them do it. He let them do what they wanted to do. Well, who wanted to do evil? They did. Who wanted good to come of the evil they were going to do? God. So God lifts his staying hand and says, all right, I'm going to let you have what you want. You want to do evil? Go ahead. Okay? But it's on you. So they do it, and then he turns that evil into good. Does that make sense? Now, in the case in point here, he used the Roman Empire to advance the growth of the church. For instance, the Roman Empire was in no sense a product of the goals or efforts of God's seed. Okay? The church did not build the Roman Empire. The church did not have any interest in building the Roman Empire. It was not in agreement with any of the goals of the Roman Empire. It had nothing to do with it. In fact, the Christian church was against the law. The Romans had passed a law condemning the Christian church and Christian worship and Christian practices. So these were clearly enemies. But God's going to use the Roman Empire to piggyback the church onto its power and allow the church to grow. But a lot of evil is going to come out of that, and that evil has to be dealt with at some point in the future. And that's the story that we're looking at here. For their own purposes, pursuing their own dreams and desires, the Romans built a world-dominating empire which covered the great bulk of the civilized world at the time of Jesus and the early church. Even now, that era is known by historians as Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. The Romans possessed political and administrative genius, but as a practical people, and they were a very practical people, they recognized that they were less culturally developed than the Greeks. To make up for their lack, they unblushingly and promiscuously borrowed from Greek culture and language. With those as the integrating supports for its cultural foundation, Rome produced a period of unparalleled peace within the civilized world. Providentially, and not coincidentally, Greek, the language most suitable to express subtle distinctions of philosophical and theological meaning, was the lingua franca of the intellectual elite of the Roman Empire. That means that it was the language that they wrote in, it was the language they spoke in, it was the language they thought in when they were trying to express ideas, because it was very, very suitable for that. And it remained so for many, many centuries after that. Over time, Latin replaced it, and then ultimately, today, English is considered the lingua franca of most of the world, certainly of the economic world. Now, in the world of scholarship, one could argue that although English is generally the most widely used, the ultimate standard of good scholarship goes back to Latin. But at that time it was Greek. Now, how does that help the church? Well, Greek's a wonderful language for expressing fine distinctions of thought, remember? And just quite coincidentally, yes, of course, the Apostle Paul was an educated Jew with Roman citizenship who hailed from a largely Greek city Tarsus, and he learned Greek as a primary language as a child. This providentially allowed him to use it to spread the gospel message with sufficient and lasting clarity, not only for his time, but for all time to come. That's why in almost every reputable Protestant church in the land, or in the world actually, the pastor is expected to be able to read and understand Greek. He's expected to be able to exegete Greek passages in the New Testament. Also, speaking of God's providentially using evil in order that good may come to pass, in the same way, with the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine in 312 AD, God used the emperor's incorporation of the Christian church as the Roman state church, which didn't happen immediately at that time, but ultimately did. I think it was in maybe 40 or 50 years later, to piggyback the church onto the empire to secure his church and launch its growth. Since God can and does use crooked sticks to draw straight lines, and I'm a wonderful example of that, a terrific crooked stick, and yet sometimes God uses me to draw straight lines, for which I'm very thankful. Anyway, he used the Roman Empire for the propagation of his gospel. The value of such a move had a limited shelf life because the Roman Empire was about force, okay? And so when we use force and we mix it with grace, we will distort grace to such an extent that it's barely recognizable. And the temptation for human beings, even regenerate human beings, who have not carefully thought about the proper and limited use of force, is to use force everywhere. Force is like a hammer. I mean, you got a problem, you got a hammer. What do you do with the problem? Well, you use the hammer. Boom. You got a stick, use the stick. Well, there are better ways than using a hammer or a stick in dealing with many problems in the world. And the problem with aligning the church with the Roman Empire is that the church's temptation after that is to use the hammer when maybe there were much better alternatives available. And of course, using the Roman Empire brought many excesses and abuses that subsequently required correction after they had exerted their evil effect. And those effects remain in the world today, but they're getting slowly but surely cut out bit by bit. But until then, the church's alliance with Rome provided the needed protection and impetus to stimulate its fragile early growth. It's another example of God using the evil that men want to do in order to advance his good purposes. It's important to note that while God has always used pagans for his ends, their evil intent and guilt are not erased by God's use of their actions as they pursue their evil agenda to unknowingly and unintentionally advance God's agenda. Their actions, although serving God's broader purposes, are evil. They bear guilt which must be avenged. An example of this is Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar, taking Israel into captivity. God's availing himself of Babylon's actions for his purposes was no more than exercising his crown rights as creator. He was sovereign over Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar as well as over Israel, and neither eliminated nor mitigated Babylon's guilt. After chastising the Jews, thus fulfilling both God's just purposes and the Babylonians' evil motives, the city was utterly destroyed, and in conformity with God's prophecy, has never been rebuilt despite repeated efforts to do so. In fact, the most recent efforts to rebuild Babylon were done by Iraq's former ruler Saddam Hussein. Babylon is in what we call Iraq today. Still a lot more to discuss, but that's enough for one day. I hope it's been helpful to you. If you have questions, please, you can text me at my phone number, 337-412-7805, or you can email me at calvinistrunner, one word, at gmail.com. Okay? And I'd love to hear from you, especially if you have questions, or even if you want to accuse me of being wrong about something. Just give me your reasons, and I'll be glad to consider it and answer any objections you may have. But I appreciate your kind attention, and I pray that God will bless you. And remember, once again, that death is not the worst thing that can happen. Being unfaithful to God is the worst thing that can happen. God bless you.